Hello, this is Immortal Technique, and you're watching Technique Tuesday's Late Night Edition. A lot of you have contacted me, asking me questions about the present situation with Iran. Many of you have asked me if I thought this was a rouse to prevent a game show host from getting impeached, whether it was the beginning of World War III, or whether it was a proxy that was being used against us by another foreign power as another long-term game. The answer that I'm going to give you is an unpopular one, and it's also the reason that I think you love and respect me. I think that it's very difficult to ambulance chase this particular one to try and get views or get a point. Unfortunately, I see a lot of pages that are parroting American propaganda, specifically CIA propaganda, saying that Iran was the #1 sponsor of terrorism in the region. That's patently false. The United States and its allies helped to foster and create the rise of ISIS. ISIS then became a permanent fixture in the region after solidifying control over large swaths of land where a destabilized Iraqi government kind of fell apart in shambles. Over the years, I think that a lot of people don't realize how much propaganda they're actually spewing. You know, whether they talk about this general or that, or what happened in Syria, I think that we should never forget that the people who are responsible for Syria are not just Bashar al-Assad, but us. We had a fake Arab Spring, unless you completely forgot, victims of propaganda out there, in which we were sold this idea that there was some democratization effort in the Middle East. And yet every cruel monarch got to keep their crown who was installed by England, and every ruler who didn't agree with the United States foreign policy was removed. This was called the Bush Doctrine. I remember there was a presidential candidate called Sarah Palin that was interviewed, and they asked her if she would continue the Bush Doctrine, and people were laughing at her, of course, because she didn't respond because she didn't know what it was. The sad part is that these liberals were laughing at her when only a couple of years later Barack Obama would continue the Bush Doctrine by knocking over countries that weren't allied to our vision for hegemonic control of the region. Libya, Tunisia, Egypt got a military dictator. The Ukraine was knocked over, although that's a much larger story and kind of bears to what's going on today in the political world. But also Syria was specifically targeted to be knocked over by our country. So before we can blame any random general in Iran for what's going on, how dare some of you fucking people be out here repeating CIA fucking propaganda, talking about how Iran is the #1 sponsor of terror in the region. If we're the ones that helped to foster ISIS in Syria to help overthrow Bashar al-Assad, and then we sponsored ISIS to then try and scare some of our rivals in the Central Asian republics that should just fall in line with what we want, then how are we not the #1 sponsor of terror in the region? I'm not saying that because I'm un-American. I'm saying that because I'm the more American one. I'm more American than the people that are out there spewing these lies. In other words, I don't want to see American lives wasted over nothing, and I'm certainly not going to sit here and fall victim to a series of State Department statistic propaganda. Another thing that we have to recognize is that there are lots of really, really damning evidence in terms of article after article after article that are written about how the United States and several NATO countries talked about the usefulness of ISIS, how they were a great leveraging tool, against people that they wanted to influence in the region. Now, again, before I go out there and make outlandish statements about what's going to happen or whether we're going to end up in World War III, I want to remind you, I'm not an ambulance chaser. I'm a person who wants to do research. I want to understand the nuance of all this. I'm not going to rush in and attack a perspective that I don't yet fully understand 100%. I think that there are a lot of layers to this. So I think before a person jumps in and decides to go full throttle towards the U.S. propaganda, or before they say, hey, this is all a sham, it's a distraction. I think that people have to really understand the human toll, the human casualties that are involved, instead of trying to oversimplify it. I think it's also clear that, there's no such thing as an anti-war president. The closest thing we got to that was Jimmy Carter. Everybody else is beholden to the military-industrial complex, even your fake golden calf hero. I mean, all of them, even the fake progressive before him. I think that that's an important thing for us to recognize as a people, regardless of what your political affiliation is. America is a different entity outside of America than it is when it plays the duopoly here against each other. War is to the benefit of no citizen of this country. We haven't been in a self-preserving war since World War II. We also haven't won a war since World War II. And I think that it's important for people to keep talking about those facts. We need to go back to the Iraq-Iran war and do research on that. We need to understand that there are a lot of evidence that proves that we aided Al-Qaeda for years. And I'm not saying this to be a conspiracy theorist. No, ladies and gentlemen. I was called a conspiracy theorist in the Revolutionary Volume 2 era for these three things, right? I said that the Iraq war is based off lies. It was. I said that the government didn't tell the truth about 9/11, the whole truth. They didn't tell you even the truth about the air to breathe. And I told people that the government would be listening in to their phone calls and emails. And that actually happened. I'm not here to make those kind of predictions now. What I'm here to tell you is that there are layers and layers and layers to what the United States can and will do to assert control over a region. Now, whereas the other players that are involved, China or Russia, that remains to be seen. I think what's important, though, is for us not to fall into the trap of rushing into judgment on these things when there are real people's lives at stake. Obviously, Iranian civilians and American service people, neither of which I want to see blown to hell. I love you guys, and instead of rushing in to do a hack job of claiming that, either this is all a setup or that the golden calf is really a hero, I think it's very important for you not to believe U.S. propaganda. There are people who will talk about the General Soleimani character, and I've never heard them talk about him before. You do a search on Twitter and you find out they've never talked about this person. So he's the wickedest person in the world that they never knew about. Iran being the number one sponsor of terror is absurd because they're supported by Russia. They're funded in many ways, their military and supplied. So that would make Russia the number one sponsor of terror in the region. Do you even hear yourselves? Like, what's wrong with you? That's what I always thought was funny about people who leave these anonymous comments. Oh, well, it goes from Hamas to Hezbollah to Iran. And I said, well, why would you stop there? And then they're like, well, what do you mean? Why would you stop there? Who sponsors Iran? And then they just stop because they don't want to go any further than that. And it's not because their imagination is a leadless pencil. It's because they literally have never really thought that one out. Please don't be that person. Please respect the fact that people have a really, really good chance of not coming home. It's not funny to me. It's not a joke. I have a lot of people that I know that didn't come back from the other ones. And I'm hoping that that doesn't happen this time. I'm hoping that there's another way.